Welcome to the Libertarian Christian Podcast. I'm your host, Cody Cook, and my guest today is George Yancey. George is a sociology professor at Baylor who's written some great books on the subjects of racial division and anti-Christian bias. He's a great follow on social media, and I love how he cuts through simplistic partisan narratives to ask the important questions. So, George, I want to thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Well, so George, you aren't a libertarian, but you are someone who I think, like libertarians, has become very disenchanted with the two-party system and what it offers us. I've appreciated your willingness to offer more objective criticism of where the two major parties are right now, which is not necessarily very good. So, for example, in a recent Facebook post, you were addressing the Democratic Party's low approval numbers, and a lot of my, entrenched liberal friends have been predictably blaming that on what they see as kind of a failure and an unwillingness to go after Trump. But you noted, and this is a quote, "The entire argument that the Democrats are suffering due to a lack of willingness to confront Trump is silly. The Democrats spent the last 8 years trying to imprison Trump, kick Trump off the ballot, opposing almost everything he proposes, calling him a fascist and getting him kicked off social media. The problem is not that Democrats do not hate Trump enough." But in that same post, you stated that you gave up on the GOP in 2016 over their willingness to get behind Trump. And so you offered what I thought was a very sober assessment that few partisans would be able to make. And I wonder if you think that having a certain level of detachment from partisan politics makes it easier, maybe to not only to keep your allegiance as a Christian in order, but maybe also just to be able to see reality in kind of a sober way. Do you feel that Christians can be partisan, or do you feel like it's really kind of a liability for our objectivity and also our faithfulness?
Yeah, if someone really believes that the Democrats or the Republican parties has the best issues, has the best stance on things, in their opinion is most closely where they say God is, I'm not going to argue with them and say that they're wrong. I may disagree with them, all right, but I'm not, it's not my big cause to say, no, you should be partisan. And part of your question is, is it easier because I'm not a partisan one way or the other, even though I'm accused of both. I'm accused of being a liberal, I'm accused of being a conservative. I think it is just, all right, I'm wearing the San Diego Charger shirt who no longer exists. I'm a partisan for the Chargers. I'm a partisan for the Longhorns. Yeah, I'm not objective. And sometimes I watch a game and I go, oh, ref, you really stunk that up. And I know in the moment I'm seeing it through the lens of my partisanship, which is sports here. And it may not be that big of a deal, but I recognize that who I want to win influences how I see a call. I think you can be partisan and say, but I'm going to recognize who I want to win influences how I interpret the situation and be open to the possibility that your interpretation is biased. I've met people who are liberal, conservative, they know they're biased, and they're willing to critique their own sides. And what I would say to a partisan person is say, okay, try as your best to pretend that the R and the D is switched. Can you honestly say you would have the same reaction? Now, a lot of them will say, well, yes, I will. And then I see some situation and they don't have the same reaction. So I know that's very difficult to do, but if you really try to do that and be very brutally honest, then maybe you can sort of see a situation a little bit differently. But it is easier if you're not invested in the R or the D.
What do you feel like? As I've watched some of the people who comment on your posts on Facebook and stuff like that, there is this tendency to get offended because they perceive you as being on the other side, even if you're not, because the way they maybe look at these issues is through kind of a tribal lens, where it's not necessarily like, well, this is right and this is wrong. It's like, this is my side and you seem to be going against my side, or wherever my side is right now. And so that means you must be on the other side, right? So there's this kind of like, you're my enemy, as opposed to like, here's where we disagree and here's where we might have an honest, parting of ways, right?
Yeah, I take them at the word that they think that their group is correct, and thus when they hear critique, they feel that I'm attacking that which is correct. I hear you. I think it is a little bit of my sideism, or a lot of my sideism and tribalism. I think that plays a role. But I think the way it works out in their mind is not that's tribal. It's not that, well, we're Democrats, of course, we're correct. We're Democrats, and therefore you should be saying it. No, we're Democrats, we're correct, and therefore you should be supporting it. The whole thing, you can see it on both ways. Like, the Republicans are saying, look what the Democrats have done. We need Trump in order to correct some of the excesses that we've seen. And, he's crude, he's rude, but he's what we need in order to change things. And then Democrats are saying Trump is going to be the end of democracy. We got to resist him with all we have. And, whatever we need to do that. So, and I think that at least large groups within those groups believe that. There's some who I think know it's being manipulated. But I think your average person who is just got caught up in it, I think they believe they're right and the other people are wrong, and they've not sat down and think, could they really be wrong all the time, and can we really be right all the time? I don't think they've really sat down and thought it that way. They probably would admit that that's probably the case, but I don't think they really thought deeply about that.
Sure. So, one thing I've thought about a little bit is this question about maybe whether Trump is kind of a unique threat or something really different in American politics. Yeah. And, coming from kind of a libertarian perspective, you sort of look at the status quo of kind of what's considered mainstream, the things that we sort of all agree on, or at least that both parties kind of agree on. And from a libertarian perspective, you say, well, whether you're doing it for this reason or that reason, if you're initiating force against peaceful people, if you're taxing people, if you're, going into people's houses and looking for drugs or whatever, all of that is aggression. So all of that's wrong. And so when you have that sort of starting point, I wonder, it makes it almost like difficult to adjudicate like who's better and worse, right? Because if they're all kind of really bad in a sort of objective sense, could Trump be worse? And I think, what I, sort of saw in particular from a lot of libertarians who maybe were open to Trump being better was this sort of sense that there was this kind of left-right coalition on, all the kind of the war state and all this other stuff. And you have this guy who comes in and maybe he doesn't really believe anything, but those people who have been getting us involved in all these wars and doing all these horrible things, they don't like him, right? So it's like, so maybe he might be better, right? And there's maybe also just a sense that, well, it's so bad it can't possibly get worse, which I think is obviously fallacious thinking. But I'm sure the people in the Weimar Republic said that too. It can't get worse. So, do you think, as you look at someone like Trump and trying to maybe sit back and be a little bit more objective, do you see Trump as a unique threat to freedom and social stability, the way that some on the left would see it? Or do you think that's a little bit histrionic?
Well, I think Trump wants power, but, I think almost all politicians want power. Does Trump want a little bit more? I think that's possible. Maybe he's just more verbal about it, more honest about it. I think Obama was served 3 terms if he could have, 4 terms if he could have. So I'm not sure if Trump's a unique threat. One thing that I like to say is that Trump is the wrong answer to legitimate problems. And so I think the rise of Trump, which I didn't, when he first rose, I was like, what are we doing, people? And so I've come to appreciate that he's an answer to certain problems that people have not been willing to address. Now, his answers often are horrible, but they're at least answers. And if the problem's affecting you, even if the answer's not bad, that there at least is an answer is an improvement to people who say there's no answer, who give you no answer. So I think that is something that Trump has brought to the table. Come 2028, Trump's going to leave office, and he may have done a lot of damage to the country. I've no doubt that that's a possibility. He may have left some things in place that we really don't like, but he's going to leave office. And I see I ask people, what's the pathway where he doesn't leave office? And give me something that's realistic. The Supreme Court's not going to, Roberts and I'm sorry, the woman justice who's a conservative, they themselves, Barrett, yeah. Maybe the others would somehow put him, they for sure will make sure he leaves office. The military's not going to go, declare martial law, really, unless there's some real reason like we're being invaded by Mexico, literally invaded. That's not going to happen. There's no pathway I see where Trump remains in office. And so 2028, he remains he leaves office, and then we move on. And we'll see what happens in a post-Trump world. Although I will say, I think Trump has damaged the GOP. I won't say beyond repair, but it's going to take a while for the GOP to repair itself. I think he has done some damage to the GOP.
I think what scares a lot of people about Trump is kind of his lack of interest in norms. Like, I think that there's been incredible power grabs in the past, maybe kind of the sort of growing the executive's power and that sort of solitary executive idea. But it was always sort of done in a way that felt like it was kind of within the norms. And then Trump is just somebody who doesn't care. He's like, well, what are you going to do if I don't do it? It's like, well, so I'm not going to sell off my company. What are you going to do about it? It's like, well, there's not a law. They're not. And even like, the way that the courts sort of challenge what the president does, at the end of the day, the Supreme Court is not going to send soldiers in, right? So he can kind of ignore it up to a point. The only thing that I guess at a certain point, Congress has to decide whether they're going to impeach him for not actually doing what he's supposed to do. And I think that kind of lack of interest in the norms has given him, I think, sort of power that other presidents and politicians haven't had. I always talk about the Dean scream. Remember Howard Dean was running for president, and he was mic'd, and there's this big crowd, and you're hearing him on TV with the mic close to his mouth. You don't hear the big crowd, and he lets off this excited, "Ah!" And everybody the next day on the news said, well, Dean's done. And it was like he said, okay, I guess I am. But like Trump just never has that sort of moment of, oh, I guess I'm done. He just keeps going. And like that, the fact that like there's a certain kind of sense of like, you have to sort of, we sort of expect these people to kind of respect the norms. Like, is it possible that Trump just camps out on the couch in 2028, and just refuses to leave, and is whoever becomes president then really going to send in troops to come and take him out? Like, that's that kind of stuff that like just people don't want to do, because there's just this expectation of things should look peaceful. There should be respect for the norms, and Trump doesn't have it, which gives him, I think, an edge that a lot of people don't have, and makes him seem, I think, perhaps scarier maybe in some way, right? Because at least there were rules. Maybe the rules allowed a lot of horrible things to happen, but at least there were rules and we kind of played by them. I think was kind of, that's like Obama sort of made a statement like that sort of recently. But I hope you're right that it's just kind of a few years that are going to really suck, and then then it's going to be all right.
Then we get someone else who's a bad president, because that's what we do.
Yeah. Well, and you're a professor of sociology now, but your background is in economics, and I know that you're not like what I'm trying to say, like an Austrian, like probably a lot of our listeners are Austrian economists or whatever. But I mean, do you see some of Trump's kind of unilateral, tariffs and things like that? First of all, is there any sense to that kind of approach? And I guess my second of all was just, are you concerned about the fact that Trump has kind of been using all this power we've been giving to the executive that really probably shouldn't belong to the executive?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. The other day I was telling my wife, what basically comes down to Trump's a mercantilist. And the Chinese are mercantilists too, basically. And so he's playing their game. It's been a long time since I've been into the economic books, but I can't remember an economist who thought tariffs were great. Are there situations where you use them? Yes. This isn't one of them. If you're trying to develop a semiconductor industry, which would not be a bad idea, so we're not relying on Taiwan, we want to protect that industry for a few years, then I think tariffs make sense. You do that. If he's doing it if he's doing this to negotiate for, I guess there could be a sense of that. And maybe that's the ultimate plan, that he's doing it. Maybe he's playing this big game of chicken. And in the day we'll go, hey, we got better deals. But even if we do get better deals, all right, so my fundamental issue with the tariffs is, all right, let's say best case scenario. Everyone comes hat in hand and they give us these fantastic deals, and we save our industrial industry. Is that the kind of economy that we want? I think we want to maintain some industrial industry. We want to be able to produce our own steel if we have to, or perhaps semiconductors or something like that. We want some of it. But really, don't we want to be more of a service, service-oriented, intellectual economy like a lot of the Western civilizations have become? and leave a lot of the building of stuff to more third world countries, I think that's where the future is. And so even if he accomplishes what I think it could be the best case scenario, which is these tariffs are a bluff to get better deals, that he has no real do that. Yeah, and that's where I'm at.
Gotcha. Yeah. Well, so I'll shift gears a little bit into some of the stuff that you've done on kind of race relations, which I think is really interesting and a unique and I think better way to approach some of these questions. So like maybe I'll start by asking this. As I have kind of looked at the Black intellectual tradition, one of the things that I think was kind of slow for me getting into libertarianism was I always had sort of maybe a sort of progressive outlook on things like kind of race and social justice and stuff like that. And then I kind of became more aware of the fact that there's kind of more diversity of thought in the Black intellectual tradition than I've kind of been led to believe. That, you have more individualists like Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington and Zora Neale Hurston, Thomas Sowell, I would say even to some extent Malcolm X. But you also have that kind of more progressive collectivist trend of thought that's become maybe more dominant, at least in the public sphere. And it seems that I think the left has really tried to use that to suggest that being Black requires one to be on the left. I think even Joe Biden said that in a very explicit way, right? And so, but within that kind of claim, there's sort of a subclaim that if you're that there's that intellectual strain of Black individualism, maybe even Black conservatism, Black capitalism, that doesn't really count. That's somehow less authentic. So, could you speak maybe to the importance of maybe that kind of viewpoint diversity, but also maybe just of independence among Black intellectuals?
Yeah, there's been a dynamic in the African community which has made us a little bit more conformist. And that could be a good thing. Like we've been very conformist on religion and Christianity and things of this nature. So that's good. But it's also been there politically. And what Biden was touching on in a very inartful way was the pressure in the Black community to vote for Democrats and progressives and to bind the line. But there's always been Black conservatives, Black moderates who vote for Democrats. I think what's changing is that they're now voting out. The sort of conformity that used to be there is not there as strong anymore. And so they're voting based on their issues now rather than I'm Black, I vote for the Democrats because the Republicans want to, they're bad, they're evil, and that sort of thing. So I think that's been a changing dynamic because it did surprise me how well Trump is doing among especially African-American men. I did not see that coming. I thought Trump was going to win. 2016 when he won, I thought if he won again, it's basically the same reason why, because whites overwhelmingly voted for him. Whites are actually less likely to vote for him today than they were 8 years ago. But Blacks and Hispanics are voting for him in higher numbers. It's an interesting conundrum that I think that Democrats are going to have to think about. Some of the ways they've been able to approach the Black vote is not going to be as effective as it once was.
Yeah. No, so you talk about a shift maybe toward issues based. Like, what is it that you think that maybe more Black men are seeing in Trump that they didn't see in George W. Bush or George Bush or Ronald Reagan?
You see, I don't think it's Trump per se. I think it's a cohort effect. I think it's just this time. I think what's happened about community is that there's been less of a hold on. I mean, it's the postmodernism that's hit the Black community, but now you're free. And so what I think is you have Black men who probably would have voted for Bush under those conditions, now voting for Trump because they're pro-life or because they want lower taxes or because whatever issue is attractive to them.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised maybe that there's been sort of a shift that's happening. I think it's happening a little bit more slowly than like what you're seeing with like the Hispanic voting numbers for Trump, right? That was, I think, much bigger than a lot of people would have expected. And I think, for me, it was a little bit confusing because a lot of Trump's rhetoric seemed very anti-immigrant, but I didn't really think that any of his rhetoric was anti-Black. But there was this kind of sense that you got from the Democratic Party that if you were supporting Trump, you were supporting somebody who was anti-black, somebody who was.
He did have some statements in 2016 that I think were anti-black. And he's known the Black community for how should I put it, condemning Blacks who were found to be innocent of a crime, I think sexual assault or something like that.
Gotcha.
So the Black community does have reasons to be suspicious of Trump.
Gotcha. Okay, fair enough. So you wrote kind of a post-mortem of DEI in the Journal of Free Black Thought under the title "The Future of DEI," and so I'm curious, what did you think it got wrong? Do we need something like it in the future? Will it continue to exist? And I'm going to throw in kind of another question there, which is another book that you wrote on racial issues. You talked about these sort of two different perspectives, the two sort of extremes, one being colorblindness and the other, can't remember I'm sorry, I forgot the phrase. Antiracism. Thank you. Yeah. And so, after that book, Coleman Hughes, I don't know if you read his book, where he's kind of arguing for colorblindness in a sort of certain way that he's defining it as what he sees as sort of consistent with kind of the early civil rights movement's approach. And so, so anyway, maybe I'm trying to figure out how to wrap this up into one question. So what did DEI get wrong? Do we need something like it in the future? And do you feel like that kind of good faith colorblind argument has anything to say about DEI that we should be listening to?
Yeah, I'm not totally familiar with Hughes' argument, so I'll let that one go until I read it and digest it a little bit more.
Okay.
I think we need something like a DEI, but not DEI. I think that we need something. Well, that's what DEI did wrong. One of the things about anti-racism, and this is, I think it's clear to anyone who reads anti-racism that this is true. But one of the tenets of anti-racism is the role of whites to do what people of color want them to do. And that's just not sustainable. As a Christian, human depravity does not skip over you because you're a person of color. So you give people power like that, they will misuse it eventually. Whites, understandably, are going to be, wait, what? Sometimes the way feminists come across, as a man, I go, wait, what? I want to support y'all, but I don't want to give up my autonomy because some guys are jerks, or worse. So that attitude comes across in a lot of the way DEI has sometimes been done. I won't say all the time, but sometimes been done. And so there's research out there that shows that diversity programs can generate backlash, can create apathy towards people of color, that it creates less sensitivity to the plight of poor whites. There's also, it doesn't really reduce prejudice. So you can do it in a way that's more effective. And that's why I advocate. And what I would have liked to have seen, of course, this would require nuance and a level of thinking that I don't think that we're going to get from this administration. But what I would like to see is, all right, we're not going to support DEI the way it's been done. And I've been, okay, cool with that. Here's some criteria that research has shown is a more effective way of doing this. If you want support from us, you have to follow this criteria. Provoking real conversations where everyone has a seat at the table, engaging in skill development, helping people to take the perspective of others, helping everyone take the perspective of others. Research has shown that this has a more effective impact. So that's how you have to do DEI, and I think that sort of DEI can work. What we have been doing has not been working, clearly.
And do you feel like a big part of what hasn't been working is I don't know how to describe this, what sometimes gets sort of called like the struggle session aspect of DEI, that you sort of get up as a white person and you admit your complicity in racism, and it's very much more about blame assigning than sort of finding a way forward.
And it really doesn't help people of color, really. If all you do is sit around and have white people tell them how horrible they are, you're wonderful. We're Christians. We believe in human depravity. What's that going to do for us? Instead of, and I think the solutions are going to involve whites doing more than people of color. So I'm not saying that the solution means that everyone had the same responsibilities, because we've had centuries of racial abuse. But it doesn't mean that we just sit on our haunches and say, white man, please confess your sins to me. That just doesn't work. And once again, as a man, when I get that vibe from certain feminists saying, what we expect you men to do is gravel and ask for apologies and do what we want, I just want to push that away, because I'm like, well, I didn't do anything to you, so why am I going to do that? Now, when feminists approach me and talk about the problems they have and how I can help them, and I have a say in what I do and don't do, then I mean, some of the issues I want to tackle with, yes, by all means. But this sort of struggle session definitely has not been useful.
Yeah, no, and I like how you kind of distinguish those two approaches of someone coming to you that maybe you care about, that you're concerned about, and how can I help you, right? It's that approach of, as opposed to, because I think it's there's probably been times where all of us were angry at somebody and wanted to sort of put him in a put him in a captive audience and tell them everything we think is wrong with them. But generally speaking, we kind of understand that that's not very productive.
It's not very helpful.
Yeah. Okay. So, you talked about kind of moving forward, who's going to maybe have to do more, and I think that's what I see when I look at debates on race and racism in the West. It seems like they're largely about the prevalence and source of racial disparities on the one hand, and then also on the other hand, whose responsibility it is to fix them. So like an extreme liberal, I think, would say that racism is so pervasive that it leads to disparities that Black people can never really overcome. And so the responsibility is solely on white people to address those disparities. Whereas like an extreme conservative would basically say, well, there really aren't that many disparities. And when you do see them, maybe you could probably blame them on, Black American culture of, crime, opposition to education, stuff like that. And then for a solution, they would say, well, Black people just need to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps, right? And so like those are the extremes, but like I think most people are somewhere in the middle, right? They would acknowledge that, there is this stuff in the past, this, racism has been an issue. John McWhorter even wrote about that to some degree in Losing the Race in 2000, where he was sort of saying there are things that, he was speaking not exactly as a conservative, but maybe as sort of a critic, where he was saying there are some things that we can do now, but he also was, I think, acknowledging that a lot of where we are now followed a path, that racism got us here in some way, right? Not necessarily that it's so prevalent now that we can't fix it, but like that ultimately there's a reason that we're where we are, that it starts there, right? And so, I think I think most of us are kind of in the middle on that. So, I mean, do you feel like that's really where the debate should be held? Is it about disparities and responsibilities? Or is there something else we should be saying, is in particular coming maybe from a Christian perspective? Is there something that we can bring into this conversation that could be maybe more productive, more helpful, more loving? What do you think?
Yeah. Yes. So my approach is that we have to have better conversations with each other. So we've not had good conversations where we take into consideration everyone's concerns. And because we've not had those hard conversations, we talk past each other, we demonize each other, we remain polarized, all that happens. And so that would be my focus. The solutions to a particular problem may lie more in the anti-racism genre, or it may lie more in the colorblind genre. I mean, I tell people, look, I criticize both colorblindness and anti-racism. Yet there are times in which I engage in the anti-racism thing because that's what's appropriate. And there are times I engage in the colorblind thing because that's what's appropriate. And there are times where, there's a mix and match, perhaps. So I think, that is a dynamic that we have to look at. I would say that there was a survey out, I think about 3 or 4 years ago, and it was talking about critical race theory, but now it's a hot topic. Everything's critical race theory. And it showed about 20% of people really loved it, and 25% of people really hated it, and then 55% of people in the middle. And I think that probably reflects how people think about race. There's probably about 20% who are very racially progressive, for lack of a better term, and 25% are very racially conservative. And then the rest are sort of like racial moderates. And that's probably the way our country is. That the extremists, they could all dare play, but most people are not extreme, is my sense of things.
Yeah. No, and I think part of what we do wrong sometimes is we insist on kind of totalizing explanations. And so, we look at something like CRT and we say it has to either be 100% right or 100% wrong, right? And so and it's like, well, maybe it's a filter that's helpful sometimes, but not every time, right? Yeah. So, how does the early church's debate over the terms of Gentile inclusion maybe give us guidance for building a diverse, but also maybe like a healthy, maybe not just a healthy society, but a healthy church maybe in our contemporary context? So like, in light of past racism, you hear a lot of advocates for like voluntary Black self-segregation. And they argue that Black people really need a space that's largely white free in order to feel safe and comfortable. And I can understand that on some level. But it also seems like the kind of argument that I don't think Paul would have been comfortable making in like Galatians, right? So what are your thoughts on those kinds of arguments about sort of self-segregation, especially within Christian spaces?
Yeah, I think that's a perspective that needs to be discussed within that particular congregation. If African Americans articulate, hey, we're not trying to like escape you. We just need some time. I'm not as troubled with. I'll tell you why. Most Christian congregations have male only and female only spaces. Well, why do they have male and female only spaces? Because there's certain challenges that men face that women don't face as much, and vice versa, or maybe not at all. And I would say that there are times where African Americans face a certain challenge that whites don't tend to face, and maybe they need to process that with other African Americans. I would not be opposed if sometimes whites have a white-only space to process certain things. I don't think that that's inherently racist or anything like that. Now, if a bunch of African Americans step into and say, hey, we're going to have these Black-only spaces, and just sort of announced it and just said, hey, power to the people, we're having... That's more problematic. I think it's something that you would develop in conversation with each other so people understand what it's about. I've had African Americans say, yeah, we want Black-only spaces in our church. If we want a Black church, there's plenty of them out there. We're in this church because we want to be in a wider, more multiracial church, but we also want a time in which we can address certain issues of our own. So I'm not as troubled by that. I don't know what Paul would say, to be honest. I mean, I think it's a fair argument. And maybe our situation is different enough that it's not relevant, but I would have to think more deeply about that. But yeah, I personally wouldn't have a problem with that.
Yeah, no, and I think in the context of sort of a church of saying, we're going to provide a space for women to do this or have this conversation, or Black members of the church to have this conversation, I'm much more comfortable with it there. I'm also comfortable with the reality that there is a historically Black church, and that if you go to a African Methodist Episcopal church, it's going to be majority Black, right? I think I would feel less comfortable with the idea that they would be kicking out people who are white coming in the doors, right? Just like I would feel very uncomfortable with a majority white church kicking out people coming in the doors who are Black. But I like how you sort of talk about starting within that space, that we're having a conversation together, because we are the body of Christ, and race is not really a significant component within the body of Christ. It doesn't really matter, but there are still things that maybe we, maybe at times need to sort of think about in different sections, because the church does different things for different people at different times. And so that I think there's some validity to that argument. So I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears again and talk about anti-Christian bias, particularly in academia. So a big part of kind of the culture war today is over what might be called the populist elite divide. And I think that actually has become more significant than the left and right one. But so many have a sense now that, the experts, in quotes, can't be trusted, that they're out of touch, that they're stuck in an echo chamber, that they're bigoted against Christians and non-progressives. So what did your research on academic bias show, in particular with political divides and also religious divides? So if I may, I'll just give an example. I was recently looking at PhD programs, but I was looking at a Catholic kind of left-wing university, and I was putting together my CV, and I asked a couple friends who were PhDs, should I say that I'm working for the Libertarian Christian Institute, or do you think that would hurt me? And they said, I probably wouldn't put that in your CV. And so, I mean, did you find that having unpopular political perspectives, or, well, I'll not say unpopular, non-lefty, we'll say, or Christian perspectives was something that would keep you out of academia or put you in kind of a low tier position?
Yeah, now this is an interesting question because when I went into this research, when I started it, I think around 2011 or something like that, I thought that there's going to be stronger political bias and religious bias. And the reason why I thought that was I knew that there was organizations of Christian sociologists and Christian psychologists and things of that nature. I knew of no organization of Republican sociologists or Republican psychologists or anything like that. And so in the liberal arts, you could find, you can find Christian organizations, but not Republican. When I did the research, it was the opposite. That there was political bias, but religious bias against evangelicals and fundamentalists was stronger. And I think it's because my thinking, without having done a lot of qualitative work on political bias, I have done on some religious bias, is that if you think about a Republican, what are you thinking about? I mean, you could think about a Republican that's very right wing, or you think about a moderate Republican. Republican sort of creates this sort of space. When I find that when secular academics think about Christians, they automatically go to evangelical fundamentalist Christians. So in a sense, it's like, well, if I go Republican, I might get one of those nice Republicans who just wants their taxes a little bit lower, and yeah, they vote for Republican, but maybe another they vote for a Democrat and that sort of thing. I get a Christian, I'm gonna get one of these, Westboro Baptist nut jobs. So I think that is part of what's happening. That there's this sort of dynamic of how people interpret who Christianity and who Christians are, and I think that is part of why there's more religious bias than political bias. There definitely is this, but you mentioned the elites and the populace. There definitely is this sort of dynamic where Christians are the populace, in that, well, they're the non-elitists. That while Christians can gain political power, if you look at conservative Christians and compare them to other groups, they tend to have less income, less education, less cultural power, clearly. These things make them non-elites. So there's talk about how Christians is the majority group in the United States. And that's fair up to a point. But if you're talking about majority group as having disproportionate power, other than sometimes politically, that's really not the case. Not relative to their numbers. And so Christians sort of, I think they went from a point where they were dominant in a lot of ways to where they're not, and they've had to adjust to that. Likewise, I think a lot of the progressives who at one point culturally were struggling, now they almost, until this last election, they controlled the culture. This last election put some doubt in them so that they control the culture. And now they're having to adjust to that. So we've had an adjustment in my lifetime, I think, of the sort of switcheroo that's taken place.
Do you feel like, the kind of low percentage of Christians and conservatives in academia relative to the kind of the broader culture, do you think that that's a result of bias against them within academia, or do you think there's sort of a self-selection that happens there where sort of conservatives say, I'm not really interested in academia, I'm going to go get a job and make money, something like that? What do you think it accounts for that difference there?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big question. And when you point out that there's a disproportionate low number, people will say, well, self-selection. And I do think self-selection does happen. I do think there is some self-selection, but I do also think that there is a bias and prejudice that works against as well. So I think it's a both and. I'm confident saying it's a both and. What I'm not confident is saying it's more one than the other. I'm not sure about that. I don't think the data has clarified that. But I do think that there is some dynamics where, there is a bias against bias in academia against conservative Christians, and it does limit the potential success a conservative Christian has in academia. Although some of them are able to overcome that. Kind of like Oprah Winfrey is a billionaire. She's overcome the fact she's a Black woman.
Right.
But on average, Black women make less money than most other groups.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I kind of struggle a little bit because I love the idea of academia, and I love the idea of scholarship. but kind of putting myself in those environments that are a little bit more secular, sometimes I kind of wonder, like, do I belong here? Is this a place for me? Is this a place that's doing the kind of work that I would find interesting? Am I going to have to jump through a lot of hoops that I just don't find to be, worth my while? And so there maybe is a little bit of a chicken and the egg thing as it kind of, as it shifts more to the left, over time, you just have people who are maybe not there, who just see it and go, maybe I don't really want to be a part of this. But yeah, it's tough to discern exactly what goes into it. What are your thoughts on the Trump's State Department recently ordering its employees to report on their coworkers showing anti-Christian bias? And so, as a libertarian Christian, I like the idea of watching out for anti-Christian bias, but I really don't like the idea of a government initiative to police thoughts, attitudes, and speech. Would that mean I think you could call it, maybe woke right or MAGA DEI. I don't know. Yeah. But what are your thoughts on that initiative?
Yeah, it does sound like the response bias teams that were so prominent only a few years ago. And I think it creates the same types of problems that if you look for bias, you're going to find it everywhere, even when it doesn't exist. And that's what research has shown, that's what's happening with the response bias teams. I have no doubt that would eventually happen with this. Now, what I would say, which I would like to say, hey, along with being sensitive to bias against Muslims and Jews and atheists, also be sensitive to bias against Christians, that it does happen. Because I do feel that before Trump, if a Christian complained about something, people would say, well, you're the majority group.
Yeah.
What, and blow it off. I think that's wrong. I think that helped create some of this stuff.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can't support, I can't support response bias teams, even if it's for my people per se.
No, yeah, fair point. Well, I in watching on social media and then this conversation, you struck me as somebody who makes a point to listen to others' perspectives carefully and just actually try to understand them. Could you speak to our need as humans to do that better? And also, just out of curiosity, what are a few sources that maybe you don't necessarily always agree with, but you think are doing really excellent, good faith work in analyzing politics and culture that you would say you'd recommend to others to kind of add to their, add to their menu of sources that they get information from?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we as a society definitely could benefit from engaging in active listening. And, I'm not perfect about it. I sometimes fly off at the handle too. But, I have a general rule. Whenever there's an event, a shooting, something like that, I wait 24 hours before I comment on it. So I want to make sure that the information is out there, at least 24 hours, sometimes longer than that. And I think that listen first, speaks second is a good approach. As far as sources, I listen to, sources across the spectrum. And in order to get opinions, so I do listen to CNN, I do listen to Fox News. Probably the people on it that I tend to listen to, I've become somewhat of a fan of what's her name? The woman on for Laura Coates on CNN, not there, Abby Phillips.
Okay.
Because she has a diverse panel. And so it's kind of cool to see, all right, you present this idea, now you have to defend it against someone who disagrees with you. So I've come to appreciate that. I used to like Megyn Kelly on Fox News. She has a podcast, and I think she's actually gotten a little more right in her podcast. So
she's got a little more culture war, I feel like, in particular.
Yeah. Which is interesting because she doesn't strike me as a cultural Christian. As a Christian as a Christian who would be, big into the cultural war on abortion and that sort of stuff. She doesn't strike me as that. But I think on the trans issue, she's become very much so. So I think she's still an interesting listen. I think I watch her better when she was on Fox News. And so Fox News is sort of hit and miss now. I think that when she left it really made it weaker in a lot of ways. But it's still worth listening to just to get that perspective again and again. So yeah, those are some of the some of the people that I listen to from time to time.
You don't get your perspectives solely from the Daily Wire or anything like that?
No, I appreciate that things are progressive or conservative, but then there's the other 98% or other 99%, and then Breitbart, and so I just don't think there's much value when I think things like, and some people are going to disagree with me, that's fine. I think things like Fox and CNN at least kind of try to get it right, and they have a bias. And, okay, I can live with that. I just don't think some of these extreme groups, I don't think they really even try to get it right. So I think that's a big difference.
Yeah, I mean, that was, I grew up when talk radio was still kind of a big thing. And that was a sense you got that they were reading talking points, right? That George W. Bush's team had said something that morning and that was what they were going to be talking about that day. And I don't find that particularly useful, but
No.
yeah, I mean, I've really enjoyed Jonah Goldberg's analysis as somebody who's kind of a neocon, but was also really critical of Trump. And I'm not a neocon, but I am critical of Trump. But I think what Goldberg gave me, I think, was a sense of appreciation for the conservative intellectual tradition that I was maybe not as aware of before I started listening to him. And so even where I disagreed with it, I was able to appreciate it more. So, but yeah, I was going to say, I was going to try to come up with a good example of somebody on the left who I think is really, really helpful, but off the top of my head, I'm not thinking of anybody, but if you get it.
Chris, I think it's Chris Cenzilla. I think that's how you say his name.
Okay.
He's done some interesting podcasting of late, and I think he's probably more on the left than the right, but he tries to be as honest as possible, and so he will critique the left.
Okay.
So I'm starting to appreciate his work a little bit.
And what's the name of his podcast?
Chris Cenzilla. So I don't know how to spell his name.
I'll try to find it. If I can find it, I'll put it in the show notes.
And he has a really short podcast, which is good for me.
Okay, good. Yeah, that's helpful. Well, George, I want to be sensitive about your time. We're right at about 50 minutes. So I'll maybe try to wrap it up here and just tell you thank you for taking the time and to talk to us and share your perspective. And also, where can people find your work and read your books and find you on social media?
Well, I do have a website called georgeyancey.com. It probably needs to be updated a little bit, but at least my books are all on there.
Yeah.
You can find me on Facebook and Twitter. Just George Yancey. You spell Yancey, make sure it's C-E-Y, because there is a Yancey with C-Y, and people confuse us.
Yeah, well, and I'll mention, so your website does have some good stuff about the books and has your social media links, but I couldn't tell on there when I went to your news and events if it was from this year or a previous year.
Yeah, that needs updating.
Well, and
that needs updating. I get busy doing stuff.
Sure.
Oh man, that's probably from a year ago, to be honest.
Well, I was going to say, I couldn't tell for sure for two reasons. One, because there wasn't it mentions a month and a date for events, but not a year. But the other thing was, at the top of it, it says, as more people are vaccinated, speaking opportunities are starting to open up again. That felt like a couple years old.
Yeah, that's a couple of years old. Yeah, so thanks for reminding me. I probably need in a couple of weeks to get and update that a little bit.
Sure thing. Well, I'm in Cincinnati, so I'll keep an eye on it. And if you're coming anywhere near me, I'll be sure to come see wherever you're at.
That'd be great.
All right. Well, thank you so much, George. I really appreciate your time, and I hope people check you out and add you to their list of folks that they read and follow.
Okay. Thanks, Cody. Blessings.
Thanks, George.